The first thing Thomas Hartley noticed about the Western Front was not the smell of death or the thunder of artillery. It was the silence between the explosions, a silence so heavy it pressed against his chest like a hand trying to stop his heart. He stood in the communication trench, gripping his Lee Enfield rifle, watching rats the size of cats scurry past his boots. France, 1916. The Somme. He was 19 years old, fresh from a Yorkshire farm where the loudest sound had been his father's cough in the morning cold. Now he stood in a wound carved into the earth, surrounded by men who looked more like ghosts than soldiers. New blood, someone muttered. Thomas turned to see a sergeant approaching, a thick-necked man with eyes that had seen too much. 3 stripes on his sleeve, a scar running from his ear to his jaw. His name was Malcolm Bryce, and he walked like a man who had already died once and no longer feared doing it again. Bryce stopped in front of Thomas and looked at the rifle in his hands. "You know how to use that?" "Yes, Sergeant. Trained at." "Forget your training." Bryce took the rifle from Thomas's hands, turned it over, worked the bolt with a smooth motion that made no sound. "This is a short magazine Lee Enfield. Mark III, 10 rounds in the magazine. Bolt action smoother than anything the Germans have. You can fire 15 aimed shots in a minute if you're good. 20 if you're better." He handed it back. "The Germans call our rifle fire machine gun fire. They don't believe men can shoot this fast. That fear keeps you alive." Thomas held the rifle tighter. It felt heavier now. More important, that night he learned why. The German raid came at 3 in the morning. No warning, just the sudden crack of grenades and the screams of men waking to find bayonets in their throats. Thomas scrambled from his dugout, heart pounding, fingers numb. Around him, shadows moved in the dark. Some British, some German, impossible to tell, which a flare burst overhead. White light flooded the trench. Thomas saw a German soldier 10 feet away, rifle raised, mouth open in a shout that never came. Bryce fired first. The German fell. Then Bryce fired again, and again. His Lee Enfield sang in the chaos, a rhythm of death that Thomas would never forget. Bolt back, bolt forward, squeeze. Bolt back, bolt forward, squeeze. 10 rounds in seconds. The Germans who had breached the trench began to fall before they could understand what was happening. Thomas raised his own rifle. His hand shook. A German emerged from the smoke, bayonet gleaming. Thomas pulled the trigger. The kick slammed his shoulder. The German dropped, but he didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel relief. He felt nothing at all, just a cold emptiness that spread through his body like water filling a sinking ship. The raid lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, 12 Germans lay dead in the trench. 3 British soldiers had fallen. Thomas stood among the bodies, rifle still raised. Unable to lower it, Bryce appeared beside him. "Breathe, lad." Thomas couldn't. Bryce took his shoulder and forced him to turn away from the corpses. "You did well. Your rifle did well. That's what matters tonight." "I killed a man," Thomas whispered. "You survived a man trying to kill you. There's a difference." Bryce looked at the Lee Enfield in Thomas's hands. "The Germans have a rifle called the WWII 98. Longer barrel, better accuracy at distance. On paper, it's superior to what you're holding." He paused. "But paper doesn't fight in trenches. Paper doesn't cycle a bolt in the dark with mud on your hands and fear in your throat. That rifle you're holding was built for this war. For the mud. For the chaos. For men like you who need to fire fast and keep firing until the enemy stops coming." Thomas looked down at his rifle. The wood was already scratched. The metal was cold, but it saved his life. "The Germans build weapons for the war they want," Bryce said quietly. "We build weapons for the war we have." That night, Thomas did not sleep. He sat in his dugout, cleaning his rifle by candlelight, learning every curve and edge of the weapon that had kept him alive. He thought about the German he had killed, wondered if he had a family, a name, a life that would now never continue. But he also thought about tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days that stretched ahead like an endless trench. He would need this rifle for all of them. When dawn came, gray and cold, Thomas Hartley was no longer the boy who had arrived at the front. He was something else now, something harder, something quieter. And in his hands, worn but ready, The Lee Enfield waited for whatever came next. The war had only just begun. Rain had fallen for 11 days without stopping. The trenches had become rivers of brown water that swallowed men to their knees and sometimes to their waists. Soldiers stood in liquid graves, their feet rotting inside their boots, their spirits drowning long before their bodies did. Thomas Hartley no longer remembered what dry felt like. 2 months had passed since his first night at the front. 2 months of shells and screams and the constant presence of death. He had learned to sleep through artillery barges. He had learned to eat beside corpses. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving when every nerve begged him to stop. He had also learned to love his rifle. The Lee Enfield never jammed, never failed. While other equipment rotted and rusted in the endless mud, the SMLE kept working. Its bolt was designed with generous tolerances, room for dirt and grime to pass through without stopping the mechanism. Its 10-round magazine meant fewer reloads under fire. Every British soldier knew this truth. In the trenches, speed and reliability mattered more than precision. The Germans had not built their weapons for mud. Thomas discovered this during the assault on a captured German position near Thiepval. His company pushed forward after a bombardment, scrambling through craters filled with stagnant water and the remains of men who had died weeks before. They reached the German trench at dawn and found it full of bodies, some killed by shells, others by the British advance. A young soldier named Eddie Collins crouched beside a dead German officer and pulled the WWII from his hands. "Look at this," Eddie said, eyes bright with excitement. "Beautiful, isn't it? Better than our old rifles, I heard." Thomas said nothing. He had heard the same rumors. The WWII was famous for its accuracy. German snipers used it to kill from 800 yards. On paper, it was the finest bolt-action rifle in the world, but this was not paper. This was the Somme. The German counterattack came 3 hours later. A wave of gray uniforms emerged from the morning fog, bayonets fixed, voices raised in a battle cry that echoed across the ruined earth. Thomas threw himself against the trench wall and began a fire. His Lee Enfield worked perfectly. Bolt back, bolt forward, squeeze. The rhythm came naturally now, 15 aimed shots per minute, just as Bryce had taught him. Beside him, other British soldiers fired in the same rhythm. The sound was deafening, mechanical, relentless. To the Germans charging across no man's land, it must have sounded like machine guns. Eddie raised his captured WWII and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. Thomas saw Eddie's face change, confusion, then fear, then desperate understanding. The German rifle had jammed. Mud had worked its way into the bolt mechanism, and the weapon's precise engineering had become its death sentence. Eddie worked the bolt frantically, trying to clear it, but the Germans were already closing. "Eddie!" Thomas screamed that a German soldier reached the trench. His bayonet found Eddie's chest before the young man could raise his jammed rifle to defend himself. Eddie fell without a sound, still clutching the beautiful, useless weapon that had killed him. Thomas shot the German soldier. Then he shot another, then another. His magazine emptied, and he reloaded in 3 seconds, a skill drilled into him during weeks of practice. The Lee Enfield's design made it possible. The magazine could be loaded with 2 5-round charger clips in a single motion. The counterattack broke against the British line like a wave against stone. The Germans retreated, leaving their dead behind. When the firing stopped, Thomas crawled to Eddie's body. The boy was 19, the same age as Thomas. He had joined a regiment 3 weeks ago. He had talked about becoming a schoolteacher after the war. Thomas closed Eddie's eyes. Then he picked up the WWII and looked at it. The craftsmanship was undeniable. The machining was flawless. In a clean war, fought on parade grounds and firing ranges, it would have been superior to anything the British carried. But there were no clean wars. There was only mud and blood, and the desperate need to keep firing when death came screaming across the shell holes. Thomas threw the German rifle into the mud. He would never touch one again. That night, Sergeant Bryce found him cleaning his Lee Enfield by the light of a single candle. Bryce had been wounded in the arm during the counterattack, but he refused evacuation. "You understand now," Bryce said. It was not a question. Thomas nodded. He understood. The Germans built a rifle for marksmen. Bryce continued. We built a rifle for survivors. Thomas looked at the weapon in his hands, scratched, dented, covered in mud that he was slowly wiping away. It was not beautiful. It was not precise. But it was faithful. And in this war, faithfulness was everything. The bullet passed so close to Thomas Hartley's ear that he heard it whisper. A sound like a secret. A sound like death saying not yet. Spring 1917. Arras. The British Army was preparing for the largest offensive since the Somme, and Thomas was no longer a frightened boy from Yorkshire. He was a corporal now, with 2 stripes on his sleeve and eyes that had learned to see danger before it arrived. The men in his section looked to him the way he had once looked to Sergeant Bryce. Bryce was still alive, missing 2 fingers from his left hand, walking with a limp from shrapnel in his hip, but still alive. Still teaching. Still turning farm boys and factory workers into soldiers who could survive the Western Front. The rifle drill happened every morning. The Mad Minute, they called it. A tradition dating back to the Boer War, when British marksmen had learned that volume of fire could break an enemy faster than accuracy alone. 15 aimed shots in 60 seconds was the standard. The best soldiers could manage 25. The legend spoke of men who reached 38. Thomas could hit 22. Lieutenant Crawford arrived 3 days before the offensive. Fresh from England, uniform still clean, confidence untouched by reality. He had read books about modern warfare. He had studied German tactics. He believed he understood things the veterans did not. Our rifles are obsolete, Crawford announced during an officer briefing that Thomas overheard. The Germans have superior range. Superior accuracy. We should be adopting their weapons, not clinging to relics from the previous century. The veterans said nothing. They had learned that officers who talked like this either changed their minds quickly or died before they could. Bryce invited Crawford to the firing range. A demonstration, sir, Bryce said, his voice carefully neutral. To help you understand what you'll be commanding. Crawford accepted. He was not a coward. Thomas would grant him that. He was simply ignorant, and ignorance on the Western Front was a wound that healed only with blood. They set up targets at 300 yards. Crawford took a captured Gur 98, cleaned and maintained, functioning perfectly. Bryce stood beside him with Thomas's Lee Enfield. Fire when ready, sir, Bryce said. Crawford raised the German rifle. Aimed. Fired. The bolt required effort to cycle. The Guer's design prioritized a tight seal for accuracy, which meant more resistance during operation. 3 shots in 15 seconds. All 3 hit the target. Excellent accuracy, sir, Bryce said. Now observe. Despite his ruined hand, Bryce raised the Lee Enfield and began a fire. The bolt moved like water, smooth, effortless, almost silent. The rifle's rear-locking lug design allowed for a shorter bolt throw, meaning less movement between shots. Its cock-on closing action made cycling nearly automatic .15 aimed shots in 60 seconds. Everyone hit the target. Crawford stared. How is that possible? Speed, sir. Bryce handed the rifle back to Thomas. The Germans designed their weapon for snipers. 1 perfect shot from a distance. We designed ours for infantry. Many good shots in a short time. He paused. When 100 British soldiers fire together, each putting 15 to 20 rounds downrange per minute, the enemy hears 2,000 shots in 60 seconds. They believe they're facing machine guns. That belief breaks their courage before our bullets break their bodies. Crawford was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. Show me more. The offensive began on April 9th. The Battle of Arras. Thousands of British soldiers went over the top into a storm of German machine gun fire. Thomas led his section across no man's land, screaming words he could not hear over the thunder of artillery. Men fell around him. The soldier on his left vanished in a spray of red. The soldier on his right stumbled and did not rise. Thomas kept moving. There was no choice. To stop was to die. He reached the German trench and dropped into it, rifle raised. A German soldier appeared from a dugout. Thomas fired twice. The Lee Enfield's double trigger allowed for rapid aim shots. The German fell. More Germans emerged. Thomas fired again and again. His section joined him. their rifles cracking in the terrible rhythm of the mad minute. Bolt back, bolt forward, squeeze. Bolt back, bolt forward, squeeze. The German defenders broke, and our NWI noon, the position was secured. Thomas sat against the trench wall, hands shaking, rifle across his lap. Around him, medics carried away the wounded. Stretcher bearers retrieved the dead. Lieutenant Crawford appeared, uniform torn, blood on his face from a wound he had not yet noticed. He looked at the Lee Enfield in Thomas's hands. "I understand now," Crawford said quietly. Thomas nodded. He was too tired to speak. Understanding came to everyone eventually on the Western Front. The only question was whether you survived long enough to use it. The guns fell silent at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month. Thomas Hartley stood in a field near Mons, Belgium, and listened to something he had forgotten existed. Silence. Not the silence between explosions. Not the silence of men holding their breath before an assault. True silence. Complete. Absolute. The war was over. Around him, soldiers reacted in different ways. Some fell to their knees and wept. Some laughed with a wild, uncontrollable joy. Some simply stood motionless, unable to believe that the nightmare had ended. Thomas belonged to the last group. After 4 years of constant violence, peace felt like a foreign language he no longer understood. Sergeant Bryce had died at Passchendaele. A shell had landed directly on his position during the Third Battle of Ypres. They never found enough of him to bury. Thomas had carried the news inside him like a stone in his chest ever since. One more weight among many. Now, weeks after the armistice, the British Army was beginning demobilization. Soldiers would return home. Equipment would be collected and stored, and weapons would be surrendered. Thomas walked toward the collection point, his Lee Enfield in his hands. The rifle had been with him since his first day at the front. The same rifle, the same weapon, for years of mud and blood and survival, and it had never failed him. Not once. The collection point was a long table manned by quartermaster sergeants who looked as tired as everyone else. Soldiers filed past in a slow procession, placing their rifles on the table, receiving paper receipts in exchange. Some weapons were pristine, carried by men who had served in rear areas. Others were battered beyond recognition, worn down to their essential functions by years of combat. Thomas reached the table. A sergeant looked up at him. "Rifle." Thomas did not move. The sergeant frowned. "Private, Corporal," Thomas said quietly. "Corporal, your rifle, please." Thomas looked down at the Lee Enfield. The woodstock was cracked in 3 places, repaired with wire and tape. The metal was worn smooth in spots where his hands had gripped it through countless hours of waiting and fighting. There were scratches on the barrel, each one a story, a memory, a moment when death had come close and the rifle had answered. He remembered his first night in the trenches. Bryce teaching him to trust the weapon. The German raid in the dark, that he remembered Eddie Collins, dying with a jammed German rifle in his hands. He remembered the mad minute at Arras. The sound of 100 Lee Enfields firing together like a single massive heartbeat. He remembered faces. Names. Men who had stood beside him and fallen. Men whose lives had ended while his continued. The rifle had been there for all of it. The rifle had kept him alive. "Corporal." The sergeant's voice was gentler now. He had seen this before. Soldiers who could not let go. "The war is over. You don't need it anymore." Thomas wanted to argue. He wanted to explain that the rifle was more than metal and wood. It was a witness. It was proof that he had survived something that should have killed him 1,000 times. Surrendering it felt like surrendering a part of himself. But the sergeant was right. The war was over. The rifle belonged to the army now. Thomas placed the Lee Enfield on the table. His hands felt empty as he walked away without looking back. The transport trucks were waiting to carry soldiers to the coast, where ships would take them home to England. Thomas joined the queue, moving like a man in a dream. Around him, voices buzzed with excitement, talk of families waiting, jobs to find, lives to rebuild. Thomas said nothing. He did not know how to think about the future. For 4 years, survival had been his only goal. Now survival was guaranteed, and he felt lost without the struggle. Near the trucks, a group of German prisoners sat under guard. They were being held until arrangements could be made for their repatriation. Most of them looked as hollow as the British soldiers. Young men aged beyond their years, carrying invisible wounds that would never fully heal. One of the Germans, an older man with gray in his hair and a scar across his forehead, looked up as Thomas passed. His eyes moved to Thomas's empty hands, then to the collection point where Lee Enfields were being stacked in wooden crates. Lee Enfield, the German said. His English was accented but clear. We feared those. Thomas stopped. He had never spoken to a German soldier outside of combat. He had never seen them as anything but enemies, shadows to be killed before they killed him. But the war was over now. More than the machine guns, the German continued. The machine guns we expected. But your rifles. He shook his head. So many shots. So fast. We cannot believe men could fire so quickly. We thought you had weapons we did not understand. Thomas looked at the man, saw the same exhaustion he felt in himself, the same haunted eyes, the same wounds that would not show on any medical report. We did, Thomas said quietly. We had each other. The German nodded slowly. He understood. Thomas boarded the truck. As it pulled away, he looked back at the field, at the collection point, at the German prisoners, at the landscape that had consumed 4 years of his life. The rifle was gone. The war was over. But the weight of what he had carried would stay with him forever. Some burdens cannot be surrendered at any table. Some weapons become part of your soul.